This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome Marius Kwint, who is a reader in visual culture at University of Portsmouth. And Marius's work combines elements that we are interested in very much today, and also through the work we do at the Centre for the Study of the Senses, in looking at how we combine the natural and the cultural. And we've had rather less attempt to bring in the cultural, so that's why we're delighted to see you. Marius has curated in 2005 an exhibition in the Design Museum in Zurich, and more recently in the Royal Scottish Academy, an exhibition on the work of Beth Fisher. And many of you, I think, in London will have seen the wonderful exhibition at the Wellcome Galleries on brains, the mind is matter. That was a spectacularly successful exhibition, and so we're very grateful to you for that. Welcome, Marius.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you also to Colin for inviting me. It's certainly a great privilege to be here, of course, and especially because I remember being rapt at Colin's exemplary work in science engagement, his series back in the 80s, the Mind Machine. So it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to start with a little flagrant showmanship to show perhaps some of the editing skills of my project colleagues at the Wellcome in their trailer for the Brains exhibition. So we finish on the frame of Helen Piner's image, which is entitled Headache, and which formed the sort of key image for the exhibition and was put on posters around London and so on. Helen's image, we felt, was quite a good encapsulation of the idea of the show, which was really to attempt to show the brain and deal with the brain and to exhibit the brain, create an encounter with it for the public, and principally its gross anatomy, its outward form, and the role that that has played in visual culture, and also the various scientific attempts to decipher and understand the brain. So I was invited to curate this in the beginning of 2010, and immediately then confronted with the problem of how to put together a show on the brain when the brain is such a complex and vast subject. One of the ways in which I chose to do so was to look at the role of the brain as an image more widely understood through popular culture. And one of the ways in which that is arguably done is through the image of the brain in a jar, in particular giving this example from James Whale's, a still from James Whale's film, 1930 film of Frankenstein, in which, in a kind of travesty of Mary Shelley's original novel, the fact that the monster goes berserk is because he has a defective brain or an abnormal brain, the dysfunctio cerebri, which is, as you probably know, rather malevolently changed, surreptitiously changed by the blundering assistant Igor of Dr. Frankenstein. So this was an image which was, of course, derived from actual practices of brain collecting. And so it seemed to me that the practices of brain collecting would be a good hook on which to begin to understand the history of how the brain has been both dealt with and imaged. And so I was certainly aware of this motif providing, as it were, lots of kind of sci-fi thrills, as we can see the example perhaps of Doctor Who's The Brain of Morbius, in which this brain in a vat is somehow connected to a computer and therefore exerts the malevolent will of this kind of intergalactic supervillain. And various other kind of examples, Donovan's brain, whereby this brain is somehow kept alive in a vat and transmits its post-mortem or its kind of dying wishes, its malfeasance through telepathy. And of course there is the whole raft of various kind of concerns with the material of the brain in zombie movies and so on. So that sort of image became important in beginning to understand what was going on in the history, as it were, of brain collecting. I was also aware of the importance of collecting as an activity in the construction of knowledge about the natural world, partly through having taught it in my previous job at the University of Oxford. The history of collecting was what I taught with Martin Kemp at the University of Oxford between 1999 and 2008. So I turned to, partly on the recommendation of my colleagues at the Wellcome, Ken Arnold and James Peto, to a book which is quite entertaining. There may be some scholarly quibbles with it, but the overall picture is quite significant in that it puts the various kind of often orphaned brain collections that are buried in the vaults of universities and research institutes around the world, such as Cornell University, the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia. The collections, the pantheon of brains that have been deposited, with, as the subtitle of Brian Burrell's book suggests, the improbable search for meaning in the matter of famous minds. So his is a kind of skeptical survey on the attempt to sort of read intelligence in the form, the outward, largely in the outward form, rather than the cellular patterns of the human brain, by various techniques that were more or less phrenological. And so I consulted Brian Burrell. It was quite interesting that his interests in this subject area came from his work teaching mathematics at the University of Massachusetts. And he said that he wanted to write this book partly because many of his students said that, you know, I can't do maths because I haven't got a math brain. And they were kind of very conscious of the fact that you needed certain sort of predispositions, neural predispositions, according to a kind of prevailing wisdom or a popular wisdom about this. So in this case, he's shown here at the doing some of the research with me at the Cushing collection, the collection bequeathed by the great neurosurgeon Harvey Cushing at Yale University in the United States. With his back to us is Professor Dennis Spencer, who was the current custodian and an active surgeon of a neurosurgeon working chiefly on epilepsy there. More about that later. The idea of the collection, of course, as a form of categorization runs throughout the study of the history of collecting, and perhaps none more so than in these particular strange and wonderful brain collections, which involve going into various vaults and sort of somewhat dusty, abandoned spaces. This particular example, the brains of educated, orderly persons, I'm not sure if everyone's able to make out the sign there, was part of the collection of Bert Green Wilder, a famous neuroanatomist, general anatomist. Neuroanatomy was one of his interests at Cornell University in the United States in upstate New York. He was on the spectrum, if you like, of ideology that surrounds this activity. Bert Green Wilder was a relative progressive. He was an advocate of the power of nurture, perhaps, over nature. And this was particularly because of his political affiliations. He was, had been a surgeon in a black regiment in the American Civil War, the Massachusetts 55th. He was white. He was a surgeon in that regiment and had great admiration for his comrades. And participated in the debate advocating equal civil rights for African Americans and wrote a pamphlet which, in our terminology, was rather offensively entitled The Brain of the American Negro. But his his reasoning in this was that by measuring by empirical surveys of brain size and shape, he would stress the importance perhaps of cultivation over birth and also dispel many of the scientifically racist precepts that were certainly abounding in early brain science, particularly sort of following in the wake of Paul Broca and others. So his method of doing so was to get his colleagues to join the Cornell Brain Club and to donate their brains to medical research. This was seen as a kind of progressive and enlightened thing to do. There was also the equivalent archives of the American Anthropometric Association at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia. And these, therefore, are the assembled brains of the colleagues of Bert Green Wilder. He also had an archive of the brains of unknown, disorderly and idle persons, and those were sometimes sourced from the execution chamber at nearby Binghamton Prison. This is the collection today, and it fell upon, unfortunately, upon one of the shoulders of one of the psychology lecturers in the department there at Cornell to try and recurate this, and some of them are now on display in the corridors there. I sourced and identified this as a particular object of particular interest. It was noted in Brian Burrell's book, the brain of Edward G. Ruloff, who was known as a scholar, a gentleman, and a murderer, who financed his researches in philosophy through crime sprees, which included unfortunately, the murder of his wife and son, and also of his 3 criminal accomplices. He went to the gallows in 1871 for the murder of a shop assistant in upstate New York. When he was about to be hanged, Mark Twain wrote a satirical letter to the press saying, please spare this man because his genius is so great that it cannot be lost to the nation, and we should hang a less intelligent man in his place. Upon his hanging, he took a long while to hang, about 40 minutes to kill off, because he was very large. He was a large man with a powerful body and neck. And there was a great clamour to obtain his brain, which in the end Bert Green Wilder won. And so his cerebral remains are here stored, and still are some of the heaviest brain on that is preserved, weighing in at a hefty 1,770 grams. So that was kind of a subject of much interest in the manner of the time, that somehow the great intellectual capacities, Ruloff was an autodidact, but was known for his extraordinary facility with languages. This was kind of an encapsulation perhaps of that belief, and perhaps a merging of the idea that the criminal, following from Cesare Lombroso's ideas, that criminality might also be observed not only in the physiognomy but in the brain that lay behind the face. The idea of archiving, then, we wanted to encapsulate this and somehow evoke the atmosphere, if you like, of a somewhat Gothic brain collection. So I went to one of my colleagues at the University of Portsmouth, no longer there, sadly. He's moved to South Bank University, a photography lecturer who immediately grasped the idea and the technical requirements necessary for carrying it out. We went, after having already surveyed various collections, including the Rudolf Virchow collection in the basement of the Charité Hospital Museum in Berlin, which seemed to me not only a kind of evocative space, but also to have much visual interest there. We determined to go back with a large format camera, 5x4 inch plates. We're using both digital and film media, and to take a series of photographs of the archiving practices to kind of evoke the brain collection, which was of course part of a general pathological collection, following from Virchow's prescription that one should study cells in order to understand the development of disease, to understand pathology. And this was one of the key images that we produced. We produced a photo essay, about half a dozen, which also included the buildings, the anatomy theatre from the outside, the chapel, the old chapel in which Many of the brains had been previously stored, had just been moved out from there. So the chapel under the rose window with the words Gehirn, brains, on the shelving there, all these kind of rather evocative spaces with the kind of traces, almost like the memory traces of shell fragments in the walls and so on from the Second World War. This was a key image for us because it seemed to represent metaphorical ways of framing how we consider the brain to work, that it involves the flow of information, perhaps a reticulated structure, perhaps rather like Golgi imagined the brain consisted of, and the kind of library function of the brain as a storehouse of memory and information. And the brain samples in here almost stored like books with in these wonderful square, specially designed jars with their spines to us. The Wellcome is known especially for its mixing of science and material culture from medicine, visual and material culture from medicine, and contemporary art. It has a large program of sponsorship for contemporary artists who want to go and work with scientists, do residencies in laboratories, and so on. And so we chose amongst several works this one to put near the beginning of the exhibition in a kind of prologue alongside Daniel Alexander's photographs. This image, this sculpture, which is 2 blocks of lead crystal glass into which a laser-etched MRI scan of the artist's brain. The MRI scan formed during research with Piers Cornelissen on dyslexia. And the artist is indeed profoundly dyslexic, Catherine Dowson. And so this she entitled My Soul, using some of the older language that was somewhat interchangeable with the concept of mind here, and perhaps representing quite nicely not only the encapsulated brain, the idea of the brain in the jar, but also perhaps the evanescence of the brain as an organ, something which is still extremely complex for neuroscientists to fathom. And the idea perhaps also of the abnormal brain as well, giving a justification for its collection and representation in this kind of visualized fashion, this heightened by the glass. So this was a popular exhibit which was frequently went around in the media. It was also had been shown quite recently at a previous show at the German Hygiene Museum, the Deutsches Hygiene Museum in Dresden, which was called Images of the Mind. I should perhaps mention there that our concept in the show was really to concentrate on the brain as object and not to venture too far down the concept of mind, although of course that's intrinsic there. The idea was really to look at the outward form. We felt that it was such a large topic, we had to sort of put in place some fairly strict rules that our exhibit should either exhibit the brain itself or a part of it, and should therefore be a representation or an instance of the mind as matter, brain stuff. The first section we had, and the sections were kind of devised according to kind of themes that just emerged from going through the material, the salient themes. The first of those themes was entitled Measuring and Classifying, looking at the historic attempt to sort of, as it were, read variations in human capacity in the brain and its variations in form and structure. And in particular, the example, of course, of phrenology, which is fairly well known. This particular exhibit was from the Science Museum stores, and I believe it also was in the Spectacular Bodies exhibition that Marina and Martin curated back in 2000. So one or two objects do sort of emerge from the archive as kind of star objects. This was the cast of a microcephalic woman who died aged 24 in around 1829, and whose head, as you can see, was cast in the manner of the time as a kind of teaching aid, and then phrenologized with the various faculties that were thought, according to the theories of the time, sort of developing from the work of Franz Gall in the late 18th century, the idea that the various faculties were localized in the brain, which is, of course, in a somewhat less distorted and commercialized way, is still an important tenet of neuroscience. Her skull was also kind of phrenologized, and we had the cast of that with the kind of incision mark around the cap from which the brain had been removed. Of course, as part of the ideological investigation into some of the origins of modern brain science, we have it's impossible to avoid the overarching influence of eugenics and the work, for instance, of Francis Galton, who, of course, set up the Galton Eugenics Institute not far from here at University College London. And this was an example of his head spanner, which was, of course, to be employed for the measurement of the heads, frequently of imperial subjects. There were various versions of this kind of apparatus available. One could buy it in a gentleman's outfitters to take out to the colonies, various forms of calipers for the measuring of heads. And they were, for instance, not this particular model, but a version of it was applied in this example of a magic lantern slide by Alfred Haddon, one of the fathers of modern anthropology. In a survey, he set up the Dublin Anthropometric Society and thought that it might be interesting to look at the populations of the west coast of Ireland, particularly the Aran Islands, which were held by some folklorists and others to be the last bastion of a kind of pure Irish race. They concluded very little from this investigation, which had to recruit, because some of the, understandably, as was often the case, some of the residents resented this intrusion and this mensuration of their heads. He had to recruit the police to help out and perhaps to maintain order as well. They concluded relatively little, apart from apparently the fact that, quote, the population was very good looking. But so we then move on to the next section, which was broadly entitled Mapping and Modelling and Mapping, which is really about how the form of the brain has been represented with ever more exacting detail and penetrative insight since roughly around 1500. We had, of course, the Wellcome Library, fantastic major research library, some 5 million volumes, I gather, which we were able to use and draw out well-known examples such as Vesalius's illustration from his On the Fabric of the Human Body, 1555, using some of Titian's studio artists to represent the fabric of the brain, and the development of the interest in the neural matter and moving away perhaps from a more Galenic emphasis on the importance of the ventricles, that is the fluid-filled cavities in the brain, moving away from that 2nd century AD Greco-Roman classical precedent and beginning to investigate the fabric of the brain tissue itself and the cortex. But nevertheless, in this case, it is although it's a rather impressive woodcut, the depiction of this kind of rapidly putrefying brain tissue is somewhat approximate and is not measured out. And then we have the kind of oscillation perhaps between the schematics, the more diagrammatic representation, such as René Descartes famously with his notion that the vital spirits were principally contained within the pineal gland at the center of the brain, and operated, if you like, and I expect perhaps to be corrected on this, that almost like a series kind of hydraulic vessels running through the nerves through to the muscles. And so the kind of diagrammatic but not anatomically very accurate or exacting representations also shown here. And then, of course, Thomas Willis's famous on the anatomy of the brain, which was the result of numerous dissections in Oxford in the mid-16th century, in which, of course, Sir Christopher Wren famously observed and participated, and it is thought produced this engraving which shows the circle of Willis with the arteries, the fail-safe system of arterial supply at the base of the brain, utilizing new techniques for removing the brain intact during dissection. The classical tradition, if you like, in anatomical illustration represented by three-dimensional moulage at a time Of course, when not only were cadavers relatively precious and in short supply, but liable to rot quickly, that we have such images as Joseph Towns' indication of the brain in situ, as in this case from the Gordon Museum at Guy's Hospital in London. And he worked only for Guy's and was an extraordinarily capable sculptor in marble, produced many busts as well. But this was much of his bread and butter, was to produce moulage such as this example, utilizing this rather kind of evocative pose, which was a conventional way for laying out the cadaver. And then running even to these very kind of improvised provisional teaching models, such as this box brain, which had been used as a doorstop at the Anatomy Museum at my alma mater of Aberdeen University, with the labels and a well-worn evidence of well usage in this. We also produced and we commissioned a number of artworks as part of this exhibition, one of whom was made by Andrew Carney, to whom I was introduced by Martin Kemp, and we've since become firm friends. Andrew Carney is quite well known, amongst other things, for producing a work which first showed at the exhibition Head On in 2002 at the Science Museum, which was Magic Forest, based largely upon the drawings of Santiago Ramon y Cajal, these wonderful dendrites growing up within an enclosed space, an installation which uses gauze screens to project from 35mm slide projectors this kind of evolving pattern, or the growing pattern of the brain, with representations of apoptosis, cell death, and so on. And so this immersive experience was very much part of that one is almost going inside the brain in Magic Forest. However, what we wanted to get with this exhibition was less an emphasis on the microstructures of the brain and more on the macrostructure and if you like, the anatomy and the gross anatomy and the techniques by which those had been represented. One of which was, of course, to use slicing through the head in order to find out what was inside it. We had in the Wellcome Library the Brain Atlas, Atlas of Head Slices by William McEwen from 1893, just on the eve of the invention of the X-ray, which largely rendered that, or somewhat rendered that approach obsolete. The idea of this Atlas of Head Sections, which was to produce an index for surgeons working who were beginning then to work more successfully on things like brain abscesses and tumors, partly by identifying the neurological effects and then thereby localizing it to a specific point in the brain and going in. Of course, a risky procedure, so the better the surgeon knew the anatomy of the brain, the better the outcome for the likely outcome for the patient. So this wonderful atlas was produced by freezing slices of human heads, and they almost have a kind of X-ray appearance in these kind of rather finely produced photographs within it, and perhaps even verge on MRI scans in their sort of monochrome appearance. So Andrew Carney did a slowly moving, some meditative piece of work, a video installation, which was really not so much immersive as objectifying, and which proceeds through the various slices of the brain and then through to photographs of the original sections, modern photographs of those as well, which are stored in the Hunterian in Glasgow. And this was his piece called Atlas. So I mentioned that we didn't want primarily to deal with the microstructure, the world of neurons in this exhibition, nor particularly with function. The idea was to if you like, to suppress that and try and really work on the idea of the brain in context, the practice, and the objectification of it. However, it was hard to sort of deal with the understanding of the brain, and also aesthetically hard to reject the appeal of the work of Santiago Ramon y Cajal, the Nobel Prize-winning anatomist who shared the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine in 1906 with Camillo Golgi. And indeed, of course, Cajal, as many of you will know, was credited with the invention, if you like, or the discovery, I should say, of the brain cell by using silver nitrate and other forms of staining which elucidate or pick out relatively few cells from the neural mass, brain cells, and which enable their photographing or in this case, their drawing. And Cajal was a prolific a drawer of brain cells and other anatomical structures. And so the research for this wonderfully involved my going to meet Cajal's granddaughter in Madrid. And this is a drawing which she lent to the exhibition, currently showing in Manchester. This was the first time that Cajal's, as far as we know, the first time that Cajal's original drawings were exhibited in the UK, and this is the drawing on the fabric of her sofa that I photographed here. So we had a few of these drawings as well as some of his personal effects. And the idea of this was to show, really, I suppose, if you like, the craft techniques, the skills that are involved and that have been historically involved in neuroscience and neuroscientific visualization, and simply the drawing of what one sees down the microscope. And of course, some of you may know that Cajal did express ambitions to become an artist when he was a child. He was the son of a village doctor who thought it an unsuitable profession for a gentleman, and so therefore he went into medicine and then from then into anatomy. But looking at some of his old books, there is, for instance, in the margins of one of his textbooks, a drawing of the Apollo Belvedere that he'd done, a sketch of that in the margins of one of his textbooks. And the textbook looks remarkably unannotated, but there is this kind of, doodle in the corner. So the Cajal tradition was something which was very much stressed when I went to visit Margaret's colleague at Harvard, Jeff Lichtman, who is known as one of the leaders of the team that produced the so-called brainbow mouse, the transgenic mouse, which has its neurons engineered to fluoresce rather differently, and therefore under special photographic conditions and then digital enhancement, one can separate and differentiate the individual neurons and their separate paths, which gives one a very powerful tool for analyzing the connections between neurons, which one then does partly through kind of massive data crunching exercises. And Jeff Lichtman seemed to be, he was very aware of this tradition of the kind of separating out of neurons and getting a partial view of the brain structure in order to sort of produce or induct, in this case, a whole. And I've perhaps somewhat included this image because I want it to contrast with the image of Cajal, almost looking, if you like, this is old style neuroscience, and this is the newer kind, which is using many of the digital tools at our disposal. The next section, we didn't want to sort of leave behind. Actually, I should just go back a moment because there is just a little demonstration here. One of the areas that the Wellcome became interested in was in recent years, and this is partly because of the initiatives of Danny Birchall, their kind of web supervisor, was to use gaming as a device for science communication. And so we we had a meeting with some games developers, and particularly Richard Wingate, who I've collaborated with a bit. He is a neuroscientist at King's College London. And we collaborated a bit on this show on the dendrites before in 2005 and became interested in the idea of neural patterns, neural flow, and if you like, the visual culture that emerges from that insight, but also the role of visual culture in informing how brains are seen at the micro level. And so we produced this game, which is rather noisy. I'll maybe switch the sound off if I can. There we are. I'll switch the sound off. But to give you an idea, it's a kind of Jeopardy game where you have to grow your neuron, and where you then try and sort of aim for these protein targets before you get killed off here. And it gets harder and harder. And it's quite an easy, simple game to grasp, intuitive, and you can get the idea here. and if I can just see if I can navigate a little bit further, and then you get a sudden boost from going on to another type of neuron. So it is kind of, there is an attempt to explain the science behind it. Then you die, and then you get an indication of what kind of length of neuron you've grown, and then it says you've grown a stellate neuron, and then it takes you to the Wikipedia page and so on. But so that was a kind of example, but it was quite successful in terms of outreach because it registered about 3 million plays within the first 3 or 4 weeks. So it was, Wellcome were quite pleased with that particular aspect. So sort of going away, as it were, from the sometimes idealized notion of the nerve and its kind of rather beguiling structure, we also wanted to stress the brain, both as living and dead substance. And we had the next section was called Cutting and Treating, about interventions on the brain, physical interventions, not chemical ones, though of course fundamentally they are the same thing, including photographs of brain surgery showing the brain here during an operation by Dennis Spencer of Yale University. And of course, and there is lots and lots of material in this area, in the archives, particularly in the fantastic Science Museum stores at Blythe House, is the wonderful old National Savings Bank near Olympia, which is this kind of tremendously spooky, abandoned building, often used for film sets. And so we went in there, and in drawers there were, for instance, examples such as this, a skull from modern-day Palestine, which it shows evidence of healing after trephination or trepanning, the boring of a hole in the skull, which would have, of course, more or less effectively had the effect been able to reduce intracranial pressure, and various anthropological speculations as to why this practice might be done, not only as part of medical endeavors, but also perhaps with the somewhat mystical aim of releasing demons from the head, or whatever were conceived to be the cause of the illness. And there were various attempts. There was a great interest in this process in the early part of the 20th century. Experimental archaeology exercises by figures such as Thomas Wilson Parry, who was a doctor who attempted to use all sorts of likely methods that had been used during the Neolithic period, which was what provided us the example of the skull shown earlier, such as this shark's tooth that you can see here. And he tried them with bits of flint and shells and so on, and produced this whole kind of array of objects that he'd experimented with on samples of human skull. And he timed how long it would take you to get through the human skull with a bow with wires, and trying to get through, like a bow drill, trying to get through the skull. So because there was so much of the neurosurgical equipment amongst the many other instruments, so huge rooms with drawers full of these things, we tried to sort of concentrate, as it were, on the design attributes to sort of bring out, if you like, the materiality, which was an ongoing theme throughout the exhibition, of these particular objects, ones that had an intriguing design, such as the milling, the brass milling around this trephine here, and this kind of rather fine ebony handle. Surgical instruments at this time were often presented and stored rather as gentlemanly objects in rather appealing silk-lined boxes and so on. Having been to the archive of Harvey Cushing at Yale to do some work there, where in recent years they had this rather mouldering archive that was buried in the basement of one of the student halls there, and it was used largely it was a kind of secret knowledge amongst medical students at the time, back in the, until the 1980s, when the archive started being recurated. It had been almost a ritual of the medical society to go down there at night into the basement and commune with the so-called Cushing tumor registry, the various brain specimens and brain tumor specimens that were stored there in the shelves in the basement, as well as amongst them were an incredible number, 15,000 photographs, clinical portraits of Cushing's patients in Boston and also in Baltimore, where he had worked in the early part of the 20th century. Cushing was known for substantially reducing mortality, perioperative mortality, down from about 35 to 45%, from that down to about 10% among his patients. And part of his method was to use this kind of rather 19th century form of clinical portraiture, which adopted certain conventions which were supposed to show whether, for instance, there might be pituitary enlargement or pituitary distortions of the hands, and also to show attributes of coordination and so on. This young patient, for instance, had a large tumor on the side of her head, which you can probably make out here, and was at this time also completely blind and suffering convulsions. And so, having gone into the medical record and looked at her files, it seemed that about 15 years later she had to have several more operations, but she had made some progress. So although these conditions were frequently dangerous at the time, all, in many cases from looking at these case histories, all was not lost, and he was able to effect considerable relief. These wonderful archive, many of these images were glass plate negatives, which then had to be digitized for the first time for the exhibition. We had about half a dozen of those on display, rather psychologically compelling photographs. Cushing, of course, was, as some of you may know, not only a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Sir William Osler, his mentor, but also a very, very capable technical artist, producing such surgical illustrations as this one, which shows, if you can just about make it out on the screen, the direction of a bullet and what must be done here. The various localization, annotations of localization within the motor cortex here. It says vocal cords, forces, palate, brow, tongue, jaw, lip, and so on, and face along here. That reflects some of his earlier work that he had done. This dates from around 1911, some of the earlier work that he'd done with Sherrington in Oxford on the motor cortex of primates. Also there is a story attached to this particular image, because the profile is quite clearly that of Sir William Osler's. And later on in the First World War, when he was serving in France as a surgeon, Cushing tried in vain to save the life of Osler's son. So violence, warfare, missile wounds to the brain are, as many of you will know, an important part of the history of neuroscience, partly in determining and localizing the deficits suffered by wounded veterans of war, including, of course, the work of Tatsuji Inoue, as sort of excavated by Mitchell Glickstein, formerly of University College London. So we had examples of Inouye's work, or at least photographs of these these modified stereotactic frames, which were devices to enable the path of the bullet through principally the visual cortex to be determined, and therefore the functions of the visual cortex to be fundamentally mapped. We had example of a bullet wound in a brain, which is one of the staples of anatomical pathological collections, not this particular one, but one from the Gordon Museum. The next section, that was cutting and treating. The next section was entitled Giving and Taking, where we attempted to explore the economy, if you like, the political economy, the idea of the brain as object, almost as property, and the way that it is used and the way that it is stored and valued post-mortem principally. And one of the key case studies in this, and I was quite aware of the practice, having read around the subject, of removing brain specimens from collections that had been added to or established during the Third Reich in the German lands, and this included the process of burying and giving funeral rites to giving and affording the sanctity of the grave to the victims of brain experiments that were perpetrated as part of the Action T4, the Nazi so-called euthanasia program, in which children, disabled children and adults, but in many cases children, were murdered by somewhat surreptitious means, sometimes not so surreptitious, but means that were certainly not fully researched and discovered, at least as far as individual identities go, until the 1990s. There was certainly a recognition of this genocidal practice immediately after the war, but the justice meted out was patchy, to say the least. So this process began partly through the efforts of neuroscientists who, began asking questions about the collections that they were still, in some cases, using, and also researching with the families of those victims who had previously been somewhat shrouded in shame because of the fact that their families had been, or members of their families had been taken into mental hospitals in the first place. So what was interesting about this process to me was not so much the fact that this had gone on, which was already in the public domain, but really the practices surrounding the brain tissue, how they were ritualized in these funeral processes here, serving as a kind of index of the whole human, and the way that they were commemorated, how these particular acts, these abuses of brain science were commemorated. And so on the same weekend that we took photographs in the Charité basement, Daniel Alexander and I went to Brandenburg near Berlin, which had its own museum commemorating this amongst other episodes of its own history, which is now a psychiatric museum, quite a psychiatric hospital, quite a flourishing one. And they had a memorial there to the victims, which was not particularly visually interesting, but what was perhaps more interesting were the various graves, including this one, where the three brothers K, so-called brothers K, they're actually two cousins and a boy, who are all from the same extended family, who had an unfortunate form of dystrophy known as Pelizaeus-Merzbacher syndrome. A particular version or a particular variant of that known as Zeitelberger's disease, and indeed the neuroscientist who identified that went on to become rector of Vienna, although it's fairly widely understood that these must have been specimens supplied from murdered children. There were certainly big questions asked about his research. So these specimens were buried, and the grave and the attempt to sort of again put the viewer into the atmosphere of the place, the particularity of the place, using this large format, which isn't really done justice by this slide. And the commemorative wreaths were those provided by a surviving relative, because it had been quite recently the funeral had taken place. The anniversary of the funeral. We also took photographs of some of the interior spaces, such as this one, which was the old kitchen of the hospital, which had then been turned into a path lab and was likely where the autopsies of the murdered children, as well as those who died of natural causes, in these rather murky circumstances. Of course, psychiatric hospitals at this time had very high mortality rates anyway, so it was perhaps more feasible to disguise one's tracks. And of course, not only, and we have this kind of irony that not only in the scheme of brain collecting does one have the occasional or the instances of the transgressions of individual rights because of the alleged stupidity or disability of the victim. But on the other hand, the cases of extraordinary cleverness as well do seem to produce a fervor to study the brain, as in this case, the well-known and much documented case of the brain of Albert Einstein. And we felt that it was possible, within the context of a kind of serious ethical discussion about brain sequestration and also donation, that we could have the example of Albert Einstein's, a couple of slivers of Albert Einstein's brain from the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, where they were already on public display. So that produced, predictably, quite a lot of press interest. We also had it alongside a model produced by Mark Lithgow based on photographs, a three-dimensional model, rapid prototype based on photographs of Albert Einstein's brain, produced by Thomas Harvey, the pathologist at Princeton University Hospital, who just happened to be present on duty when Einstein was dying in 1955. Brain donation, therefore, the willing donation of brains, was the final theme with which we concluded within this section. And we had work such as this painting by William Utemolen. Many of our artworks were provided by or were part of the stable of GV Art, which is here in London in Chiltern Street, just near Baker Street Tube. And this was one of the artists, a late artist, whose agent is Robert Devchich, the director of GV Art, a gallery which does specialize in, not exclusively, but does tend to specialize in science-art interactions. And this particular example seemed to me self-portrait, it's entitled Self-Portrait with Saw. Utemolen was a sufferer of Alzheimer's disease in the latter part of his life. He was diagnosed in around 1995. This painting was started in 1997 on the day that he had pledged his brain for autopsy, and contains, of course, the theme of the instruments of the separation of the brain from the rest of his body and the likely approximate line by which his skull would be prized open. There's several other kind of iconographic attributes here which are shown, such as the black, which for him was a symbol of death, green, which represented sickness. He was also particularly fascinated by the medical accounts with which he was informed with of the plaque forming in the neurons, which which were one of the symptoms of the Alzheimer's disease. The protein plaque, which he attempted to represent by this kind of rather thickly applied lighter tone across the broad band of his forehead. So many of his self-portraits, and there is a whole series of these self-portraits, which rather movingly document his cognitive decline, do exhibit a fascination with the forehead and the skull. And the last drawing he did in 2000, about a few years before his death, I think he died in 2005 or 2007, so there was still quite a long time to go. By this stage, of course, he wasn't able to speak, but these rather moving series of self-portraits include one right at the end of his ability to draw, and where the image almost breaks down, but it takes on an interestingly modernist lucidity, and it is in some ways, it seems that his art becomes more powerful the more severe his Alzheimer's, or the more progressed his Alzheimer's becomes. Perhaps rather more optimistically, Wellcome had funded a series of works called Mind Over Matter, not the mind as matter, series of works by a geographer, a social geographer, Bronwyn Parry, and also a photographer whose name I've blanked on. I'm really sorry about that. Anya Dubrovska, sorry. And she took photographs of prospective brain donors and interviewed them around the themes of memory, why they were donating their brains, and in this particular case is the photographic portrait of a working class Londoner, Mr. Albert Webb, who made this jumper himself, knitted a portrait of his late dog Lucy. His wife had died of Alzheimer's, and he felt this was an important thing to do to pledge his brain. And the interview involved memories of his youth and fighting his way up through Italy in the Allied landings during the Second World War, where he developed a love for opera. So it was a kind of humanistic, affirmative project, this, which provided some quite moving accounts which the audience could listen to over headphones, but also see the accompanying portraits. So the brain, the idea of the brain as object, as thing, as something to which things are done, and therefore a set of practices exists around them, was of interest to me, coming at it, as it were, almost from a kind of an ethnography of science or science and technology studies perspective, and also with a kind of art historical background. I was particularly interested in the process by which the brain is processed and dissected for analysis and the way that it is archived. So, and archiving is, of course, an important theme within the contemporary arts as well. So, GV Art had previously been exposing several of its artists to brain cut-ups at Hammersmith Hospital at the Imperial College unit there, which is sponsored by Parkinson's UK and the Multiple Sclerosis Society. And so we filmed this using some of the clever media people, namely Martha Henson, who also produced the trailer at the Wellcome. And we filmed the brain cut-up. And I'm going to, if I have got time, take the liberty of showing you at least some of the video that was produced. We had it running in the exhibition, but without a commentary. This one has a commentary because it's the YouTube version. We felt that its job was to be more educational. The one in the exhibition had no commentary and really just produced the atmosphere of the whirring fridges. I was also very interested in the material culture, the storage systems, the stuff, the atmosphere of the cut-up room.
I feel terribly privileged when I'm handling human brains. This tissue is something bequested to us for research purposes, and it's an honour to be able to handle the tissue and meet that bequest. My name's Steve Gentleman. I'm the Professor of Neuropathology at Imperial College in London, and one of my jobs is to carry out the diagnostic assessment of the brains that come into our tissue bank. The first thing you do when you get the brain is to examine the external features of the brain to see if there's any clue there as to what might have gone on. So you look at the surface of the brain, the membranes that cover the brain. Is there any evidence of any infection? We then look at the patterns on the surface of the brain at the folding to see if that's normal and whether there's any shrinkage or atrophy in any particular areas. Also feel the brain to see if there's any softenings, because if there is a soft area, that may indicate there was a stroke in that area. Then look at the blood vessels at the base of the brain, and they will give us some clues as to lifestyle factors that may have been involved. They may be atherosclerotic, or hardening of the arteries, due to a high-fat diet or smoking or lack of exercise. All may contribute to this type of change. When we have a whole brain fixed in formalin, what we will do is we will make a cut through the brainstem, which is that part of the brain which is quite small but very important in carrying out all of those everyday functions that we all rely on without thinking about too much. We separate the brainstem and the cerebellum from the rest of the brain. In order to carry out the neuropathological examination in a reproducible fashion, we have to cut up the brain in a fairly stereotypical way. So we use a single point for our first cut. We have a landmark called the mammillary body. It's a part of the brain involved in housekeeping functions. And we use that as our guide for the first cut, using a rather large bread knife, if you like. That's what it looks like. We then slice the brain up into what we call coronal sections, and then space those out so that we can have a look through the whole extent of the brain to look for any pathology. And then to take some representative blocks so that we can follow up and look down the microscope at what's going on. And in this way we can build up a diagnostic report of what the problem was with that particular patient. And this is very important because the tissue then goes out to researchers and they need to know exactly what was going on. We cut the sections using a guide because there are some parts of the brain that we need to look at which are quite small. So we have to accurately make a ½ centimetre slice. When all these slices are laid out in a logical fashion, you can inspect each slice individually, working from the front to the back of the brain, just checking that all the structures are as you would expect them to be, looking for any signs of change, whether it be in multiple sclerosis, for example, there may be changes in the colour of parts of the brain. We then have to sample 20 specific anatomical areas to allow us to take them away to be stained and look at them down the microscope to try and work out which pathologies are there, because it's not always just one pathology. We have to make sure if there are multiple pathologies that we write that down, and again it's very important for the researcher. They need to know everything that's gone on in the brain.
Okay, so that's the process that interested me, and I think it's quite. I found the kind of tactility, the way that the hands, the eyes, the kind of involvement in the process, the human activity around this most interesting, and not least seeing brains on the table accompanied by their consent forms, which had been, of course, signed by the donor. So that was quite an arresting moment. So we have the brain as the hypothesis. You have the brain as kind of material object, as stuff, as human tissue, as blood and guts. But you also have then, on the other hand, a rather dematerialized version of our brain available in our culture and becoming increasingly predominant through the scanning technologies, such as we've seen, not only, or at least investigative technologies, seen with digital manipulation, as we've seen in the case of Jeff Lichtman's work in the brain bone mouse, but also in medical practice. And this particular work was a piece, it's a rather blurry slide, I'm sorry, rather low-res image, but by Nina Sellers, a young Australian artist who herself suffered a brain tumour when she was 16 and became one of Australia's first patients to undergo an MRI scan as part of the diagnosis. And she made a work based on this, which she called Encoding, Decoding the Body, a drawing, whereby the viewer could just click on here, which is a QR code with their smartphone, which would then switch to an animation of her brain, tracking through the various layers of her brain, including the tumour in the pineal body, which was removed at the cost of her sight for about 18 months. So she went blind for about 18 months and had been a promising musician, and ironically came out of that and then became a visual artist. So this particular work does kind of raise those issues rather nicely, though small and modestly drawn though it is. So how was all this put together? It's important when, how not to make it just a bunch of things in a room. The role of the designers was absolutely crucial in this, particularly the three-dimensional designer Callum Storey, who'd previously worked on the Hockney exhibition at the Royal Academy. Here he is showing his concept for the exhibition, which is based, as he termed it, on these kind of walls, which approximately would represent the slices that I had emphasized were an important way of understanding, or at least imaging, the brain. And the idea of the correspondences with these various apertures, which would allow relatively free flow of visitors through sections which were not dogmatically separated out. So there was perhaps some sort of loose cognitive analogy going on there, and structural analogy with the brain. Here you can see Ken Arnold and James Peto, who both kind of made the initial proposal to me and identified a basic concept that the exhibition should be, about the brain as an organ principally, and then I developed that into exploring, as it were, the practices around the brain and the job of collecting the brain. And here is the co-curator with whom I worked at Wellcome, just behind Callum here, Lucy Shanahan, who I have to emphasize was an excellent colleague to work with. And on her right is Lucienne Roberts, the graphic designer. More about her in a second. This is just an installation shot of Callum's design, which was quite clean and lucid and very well thought out throughout. We also had the idea of the brain in a jar. The idea of encapsulation was explored by Lucy in her main title lettering, which would be a kind of imitation of the brain in a jar with kind of layers of perspex. She actually went to the Royal College of Surgeons and found out how they do preserve wet specimens and use the same materials for that and the same manufacturers of the jars. There was enormous, on her left in this image is Jane Holmes, the exhibitions manager. There was enormous, for Jane, a lot of logistical intricacies involved in importing human specimens across the Atlantic from the US, from the Cushing collection and the Burt Green Wilder collection at Cornell. People did indeed come to the exhibition in large numbers, as Barry kindly said, 105,000 over 77 days, an increase in 22% on the daily rate of all previous Wellcome exhibitions. People also, in some cases, were rather struck by the visceral nature of some of the material and some of the brain surgery footage that we put in, albeit in black and white and relatively old, that such that we had numerous faintings, and we had to sort of censor and produce this peephole for this material. But of course, then people just sat on the floor instead. The other thing was that, of course, the press were very interested in this exhibition, and we have Helen Pino's Headache sort of cropping up on the front page of The Guardian, amongst other places, and quite a lot of featuring on the TV and broadcast media. And it has subsequently gone to Manchester, to the Museum of Science and Industry, where it's had a recuration substantially, because many of the objects we couldn't borrow twice. We recurated about a third of the total of about 160 objects. So that was quite a lot of work for me to sort of go into local archives and to talk about and to excavate objects that told stories about brain neurosurgery and neuroscience, which is fairly significant in Manchester in global terms, including, for instance, the world's first production brain scanner at the Manchester Royal Infirmary, and treasures such as this 1495 medical manuscript on the anatomy of the brain, amongst other, it's anatomy of the body. The title on the front page, anonymous, was On the Body and Soul, and showing the characteristic medieval, although, of course, remember, by this time we have Leonardo producing extraordinarily exacting and accurate drawings, but this kind of rather schematic medieval view of the lacunae, the ventricles in the brain. I haven't yet translated, nor doubt that I have the Latin to do so, the text fully. So in this second version, I think we were able to perhaps perfect in some ways the design of the exhibition, the correspondences, the visual correspondences between various objects that Callum was able to stress, albeit in a subtle way, through his design and with these various apertures, and this example, for instance, of the corrosion cast of the vascular system, the veins and arteries and capillaries of the brain. standing rather nicely here, and this image of Corinne Day's portrait of her undergoing treatment for a brain tumour, of which she died a few years ago from 1996, a former fashion photographer who was suddenly struck down with a brain tumour. So I'm going to conclude by showing you a very brief video just to summarise some of the changes that have gone on. It's a trailer video, and you'll please excuse my repetition of myself. I think on that particular morning I'd got up at 5 in the morning, so I was tiring by the time of that. But I will show you this and then invite questions. The exhibition Brains, The Mind as Matter at the Museum of Science and Industry concentrates on what has been done to the brain, not what the brain does for us. We felt that you could look up brain function in a textbook, but an exhibition should really be about seeing the real thing.
We are so proud to be the only museum outside of London to host this exhibition from the Wellcome Collection. And it covers one of the most important science issues of our time, and it puts the human brain into such beautiful, beautiful perspective. With Wellcome's support, we've been able to draw out some really significant Manchester stories that depict the internationally significant role this community has played in understanding the human brain. You'll see a 15th century depiction of the human brain within our exhibition. And you'll also see 20th century drawings of the human brain from medical artist Dorothy Davison.
To artists now, what is particularly fascinating, I think, is that not only do we have this kind of heritage, this background of meaning in the brain, but you also have all this interesting and very colourful and quite fascinating imagery that is emerging from brain science. We hope that visitors will come away with an understanding that brain science is too important to be left to scientists, and that ordinary people need to be involved in this process of looking. Scientists themselves have engaged in an almost artistic process, drawing, photographing, selecting bits of information, enhancing digital images with colours, and beginning to see the wonder of the natural world and what it means for our human experience in this kind of 1.5 kilogram clump of fatty tissue that is located within our head. A bit short on time.
Time for one or two questions before we. Great. Eric, yes, I can see that.
One thing, I thought your exhibition was excellent, wonderful.
Sorry,
a wonderful exhibition, I did go to it. But
yes.
One thing that I wasn't terribly happy about was the showing of a slice or two slices of Einstein's brain.
Yes.
I don't think Einstein actually agreed to donate it.
No, this is true.
What's the story behind that?
Yeah, I mean the full story behind that. The brain was. We had an ethical review of all those sorts of actions. I mean, Einstein willed that he be cremated, and the pathologist at Princeton University Hospital took the brain because he considered it to be of scientific interest, and then went to Einstein's son and got retroactive permission for this, and therefore it was turned in. It was sliced. There was about 40 slices sent to a fellow doctor in Philadelphia, and she then donated them to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, where they were put on public display. Yeah, I mean, it was, it was an issue of concern to us, and as I said there, we put that in the context of, we felt a serious discussion about the ethics. We also had, for instance, William Burke's brain, which hadn't been given consent to be donated either after he was hanged in Edinburgh for body snatching in 1829. But we felt that we had to kind of show the history and the artifacts of that history and the practices that obtained in the 1950s, which would no longer be thus. But yes, indeed. I mean, it did involve some, inquiries on our own part. But we felt because it was already in the public domain, whilst that doesn't excuse everything, we felt that what we were doing was a sensitive exploration of the topic.
Patricia.
Thank you. Many years ago, when as part of my art history degree, I looked at the phenomenon of collecting and exhibiting and how it was historically construed. I discovered that different representation regimes, so starting with the Cabinet of the Curiosities to a post-Enlightenment museum, told us quite a bit about different epistemic regimes.
Yeah.
How different cultures try to understand the world at different points in time. I think, tried to convince myself that the patterns of Foucault's archaeology of human science captured the evolution of collecting, not something I would stand by these days. Still, I think there's some truth to it, and I was wondering to what extent your work on how the representation of the brain evolved allowed you to pinpoint scientific breakthroughs throughout history, and what were those breakthroughs, if any?
Yes, indeed. Well, the representation of the brain, I suppose that was to some extent our premise, was that obviously that one needs to think quite hard in terms of the mediation, of the brain in terms of the way it's represented, and relate that to, the scientific discoveries and progress. So, for instance, the practice of Cajal is crucial to that in determining brain function and his identification of, that there is a neuron, that there is sort of an input-output model, and I'm sure Colin could talk about this much more informedly than I can, but certainly that Cajal is an important figure in that process, and through the almost, if you like, intuiting the pattern of impulses within the brain, and there has been quite a lot of research since. And one of the researchers I spoke to in Madrid, who put me in contact with Cajal's granddaughter, was looking, attempting to reanalyze the histological slides, and was very clear about this kind of the insights that he'd made and were continually vindicated by more modern techniques in neuroscience. So and much of that insight was really produced, arguably, through careful study, accentuated by drawing and expressed through drawing. And that was certainly a hypothesis that we had. Other examples, for instance, and we didn't have Broca, but Paul Broca and his in the Musée du Puitrin in Paris, where he stored famously the brain of an aphasic by the name of Le Bon, or Temps. He could only say one word, which was Temps. And Kathy Geer, who's recently written an article, she's an American historian of neuroscience, has recently written an article in a journal, Interdisciplinary Science Reviews, that I've co-edited. And she begins with the quite bold statement that modern neuroscience began with an act of curating, this putting of the brain of Le Bon in the jar with a very visible lesion in the area which later became known as Broca's area, and the left frontal lobe, which had brought about his aphasia. So this kind of visualization, which was enabled by technologies, preservation technologies, and a new kind of museological science, as it was called, to use a phrase that has been used in the scholarship. That is something that is very much brought around by the collection. Yeah.
I think I've answered my own question.
Yeah, just a footnote to Patricia's question.
And it's something quite interesting to us in a modern context. I mean, the great landmarks in brain science, say Vesalius or Willis and so on, actually were in a sense basic philosophical science and didn't feed into medicine. So it's really only in the 19th century that the operational techniques and the anatomical detail came together. This is quite interesting, isn't it, for those of you still employed in academics who need to deal with impact, that essentially the great markers in brain science up to the 19th century are basic philosophical inquiry into the nature of the brain rather than of utilitarian use in surgery.
Good, thank you. So I think at that point we must close for lunch. We have our own arrangements and return again at 2, but will you join me in thanking Marius very much?